Okay, everybody, welcome to the show. And as ever, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague and friend Yaakov Lappin, who's also the in-house analyst at the MirYam Institute. Yaakov, I hope you're well.
I am well, Benjamin, and I'm glad that we're back on our momentum, our weekly momentum. We have a lot to talk about, so I'm very happy about it, our opportunity
We-
to do so.
We've got a lot to talk about, and I want to begin with the very sad news that Youssef al-Ziadna, a 53-year-old, was recovered. His body was recovered from inside the Gaza Strip in the Rafah area. And not only was his body recovered, but the body of a second individual that was recovered, and it's feared to be the body of his son, Hamza, aged 22. And what this means, Yaakov, is that now 29 hostages who were kidnapped alive on October the 7th have died during their time in captivity. It also means eight of the hostages that were kidnapped alive on October the 7th have returned home by way of rescue operations. So it's a very, very sad day. I mention those two numbers because people should know and recognize that these attempts to rescue hostages are ongoing. The efforts to bring our hostages back have not relented in any way, shape, or form. But of course, they come with an enormous risk. So, eight have been successfully rescued from inside the Gaza Strip. 29, however, have died inside the Gaza Strip who were kidnapped alive. How do you reflect on this latest development, Yaakov?
Well, it's extremely sad, especially since two members of that same family were released, I believe, in November in the first hostage deal. And obviously, they were very much hoping to be, reunited with their loved ones. So it's absolutely tragic. It's heartbreaking. And I think it's also a reminder, that Hamas, when it set out on this genocidal mass murder attack, actually didn't distinguish at all between Arab Israelis, Jewish Israelis, because it views Arab Israelis as traitors. And that's why it went about, massacring them and kidnapping them just like it did Israeli Jews. And I think that sent shockwaves through the Israeli Arab community. And recent polling has suggested that they now view their fate, many, many Arab Israelis, I don't remember the exact number, but a very significant number responding to this poll, as being completely intertwined with the fate of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. So I think that Hamas's, mass murder and appalling violence, and the indiscriminate nature of it, even though they're out obviously to mass murder Israelis because it's a Jewish state and they want to destroy this Jewish state, the fact that they unleashed this violence on Arab Israelis has actually pushed many of those Arab Israelis, I think, towards the idea of really, focusing on coexistence with Israeli Jews and understanding that this is their place, that this is their country, and it kind of, absolutely weakened, I think, Hamas's goals of actually recruiting Arab Israelis to their jihad. So that's the hopeful part of it. But at a personal level, it's absolutely horrific that these people didn't survive their kidnapping, and their family is heartbroken, and it's a very sad day, for the whole country.
It's, of course, a very sad day. And it's interesting what you say, because if you recall, there was a lot of a very well-founded concern that one of the areas that Israel would have to deal with in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th was a restive Arab Israeli population. There was a very real fear within Israel that that population, based on previous riots and more, riots that had taken place in many of the cities and towns where there's largely coexistence, but a large Israeli Arab population, a large Israeli Jewish population. We'd seen riots in years gone by, but that those riots would return in support of Hamas's actions on October the 7th. And actually, that did not come to fruition. And I'm hopeful that that's indicative of a long term positive uh, existence for uh, enfranchisement of the Israeli Arab population within the state of Israel proper. So we'll wait and see with that. I think that that's an ambition that all of us have, all of us share, and was actually something which was largely presumed until those riots of several years ago took place. We'll wait and see. But one of the interesting aspects that this raises, this recovery of the body of this hostage, these two bodies, is the fact that Donald Trump's tapped Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, is on his way to the region because there seems to be a presumption that there is a real advance being made in the negotiations for a hostage release. Now, I don't really want to get too much into the minutiae of that discussion, but I do want to talk to you about something that's accompanied this and actually preempted it as well, namely this repeated threat by President-elect Donald Trump that if the hostages are not all released prior to him returning as President of the United States on January 20th, there will be, quote, all hell to pay. And I wonder what your thoughts are on Donald Trump's abilities to add real pressure to Hamas in order to bring about a release of some of the hostages, all of the hostages, any of the hostages, pick up where you like within that, given the fact that Israel has obviously applied inordinate amounts of pressure to Hamas by way of the ongoing military campaign inside the Gaza Strip. What do you think an American president can do to add more layers to that if he so wishes?
So there's a lot of ways to look at this. Let's start with what the outgoing Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, said recently. He acknowledged that every time that Hamas saw that the U.S. was publicly putting pressure on Israel regarding a ceasefire in Gaza, Hamas would take a step back from negotiations and up its demands because they saw that Israel was under pressure, and that was exactly their goal, to force the Israeli government into some sort of a deal that would enable Hamas to retake the Gaza Strip, to survive this war, to become the next, just as it was previously, the Islamist jihadist regime of Gaza. This is their whole goal. This is why they're holding the hostages. So when Donald Trump says what he says, hopefully the signal that's being sent here to Hamas, and I'll tell you in a minute, there are two Hamases here at play, but the message is that don't bank on that. Don't bank on us, the United States, pressuring Israel. Those days are over. You're holding hostages. You are war criminals. You are jihadists. And there will be no pressure that's going to be placed on Israel. Rather, the pressure is going to be placed on you. I think that's the messaging. Now, in terms of what that means practically, so there are two kinds of Hamas to look at. One is the Hamas leadership, those terrorists in suits in Qatar who are living the life in their luxurious hotels. They're in charge of the fundraising, the coordination with Qatar, with Iran, and they will definitely be feeling the pressure because I think the second Trump administration is going to be telling the Qataris, if there's no deal, look, these people are out. There are already signals that their days in Qatar are limited. They're going to have to leave their fancy lifestyles, their networking, their financial fundraising, which results in literally billions being funneled to this terrorist machine in Gaza. That's going to be under attack. So there's a lot of pressure that can be brought to bear that's not being brought to bear currently on Hamas's overseas leadership, particularly in Qatar and elsewhere, in Turkey as well. But the decision makers here, as far as Hamas are concerned, is the other Hamas. That's the military terrorist leadership, whatever's left of it in the Gaza Strip. So I'm talking about Muhammad Sinwar, the brother of Yihya, and some sort of inner group. Now these terrorists, they don't actually have control of all the terrorist cells in Gaza. They don't have centralized control. I know that essentially is a fact, but they do have the ability to decide on a truce, to decide to order the release of certain numbers of hostages. They can still negotiate. So what kind of pressure can be brought onto them? It's basically telling them that they're on their own, that they shouldn't bank on American pressure, We already know that Hezbollah is out of this war. The Iranians are not involved in this war. All of the allies that they had hoped would come to assist them in this fight against Israel are not there. They're on their own. So when they see that the United States is behind Israel, when they see that they have no allies, that could all push them into some sort of partial deal. But that's the most we're looking at, Benjamin. We're looking at a partial deal. We're not looking at a full deal because why would Hamas give up all the only thing that it really has left? This is its insurance policy. It's a terrible thing to say, but if I'm going into this depraved enemy's mind, the are the only thing they have left as an insurance policy. They have nothing else left in the Gaza Strip. So the idea that they're going to ever release all of them to me seems fanciful, no matter what President Trump says. And that leads me to think about, rescue options, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll stop here. I'll send things back your way. That's essentially how I see things.
Yeah, I think that you could see some practical steps being taken. Firstly, I don't know that anybody should take on face value, as I said a couple of podcast episodes ago, this idea that there will be all hell to pay beyond anything from the United States that the world has ever seen before. I think we understand that there's at least some degree of rhetorical flourish there from the president-elect when he says that. But we could have a change in terms of pressure being brought to Israel to, for example, funnel in and deliver humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. I was not a fan of this policy when it first was identified, this notion that we had to send in humanitarian aid. I think that the hostage release deal that we were fortunate to secure was in no small part as a result of the fact that Hamas and the Gazans were starving, right? Were starving. There wasn't the ability of them to hang tight in position in situ for an undetermined amount of time. And I think that the pressure needed to be ratcheted up. And also back then, you might recall, Yaakov, I was saying that one thing that Israel must not do is enter into a drip feed of hostages.
Yeah.
That must not become the norm. Unfortunately, to some degree, that has become the norm. Though while saying that, I, of course, am very, very grateful for the hostages that have been brought home, whether by release or by rescue. I think that you might see a change in that. And I'm not saying that there would be an entire cessation of the supply of humanitarian aid, but perhaps a reduction, and a severe reduction at that, might be something that a transactional Donald Trump and his administration would be supportive of and even call for. Remember, a number of the hostages are American citizens. I think that there's also an opportunity to see more muscular diplomacy applied to the Qataris, as you've said, and to Egypt, rather than the obsessive application of pressure by the Biden administration to Israel, as though Israel is responsible for the fact that the hostages have been seized in such an awful, awful way and were abducted on October the 7th, as though they were the party that dealt in that. I've said many, many times, if the Biden administration would have applied just a scintilla of the pressure that it did to Israel, to the Egyptians, for example, we might have seen a very, very different outcome. I also don't think it's beyond consideration, Yaakov, given that some of the hostages are US citizens, that you might actually see the deployment of some US military to the area with a view to working to bring hostages back. I don't think that that can be discounted. I think that Israel would likely cooperate if the Trump administration were to call for that. And that would be very much in keeping, incidentally, with the words of Mike Waltz, who said on a recent podcast that those who take an American hostage should prepare for the possibility they will receive a bullet in the head as a result of doing so. And you spoke about Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, and there is a conversation that's live in Israel that constantly talks about the day after. What will be the day after inside the Gaza Strip? I've said many, many times that the conversation Israelis need to have is what will be the day after this war inside the state of Israel, as the soldiers are demobilized, as our injured continue to recover, as our hostage families continue to call for the return of the hostages, as our bereaved come to terms with their terrible loss, loss of their loved ones, as our widows come to terms with raising their children without fathers in far, far too many cases. That's the conversation that Israeli policymakers really need to have. And without making any comparison between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Mohammed Sinwar, who currently seems to be the de facto head of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, I think that he's probably having an internal conversation about the day after inside Gaza. I think that he's highly unlikely to want to bring about an end to this war anytime soon because there are a lot of very furious Gazans who will be waiting to settle the score with Sinwar. And Sinwar could be another tyrant in the Middle East who is dragged through the streets by his own people and promptly dispatched from this earth. And so I think that you're going to see the elongation and the drawing out of any negotiation. I share your opinion, incidentally. Unfortunately, I don't believe that it makes any sense whatsoever to expect that Hamas would release all of the hostages, let go of its only leverage. I think that anybody who suggests that is dealing in wishful thinking or is woefully naive or is driving an agenda forward. So people might say, well, Benjamin, what do you want? I think that we need to extract as many hostages as we possibly can by way of a deal in the event that we're able to bring about a deal for the release of some of them. And I think that we also have to continue the work to rescue the remaining hostages, which is one of the reasons why the military action inside the Gaza Strip remains, in my mind, very important, very justified, and the primary source of intelligence gathering through which we may learn about the location of more hostages yet. What do you say to all of that?
Very interesting points that you've raised. When people talk to me about the end of the war in Gaza, I always ask them, okay, do you mean the end of the war or do you mean the end of the conflict? Because if you want to talk about a change in gears, a change in stages in the conflict, I think that that makes sense. Obviously, we're not always going to have, right now, the IDF has 3 divisions in the Gaza Strip. That's not always going to be the case. That's clear. But if people want to talk about the end of the conflict, I don't understand what planet they're living on. Because at the end of the day, Hamas, even though it's not the ruling regime of Gaza, it is still in Gaza. It has terrorist cells in Gaza. It is recruiting thousands of new terrorists. It's giving them AK-47s. It's giving them RPG launchers. It's giving them, bombs that they still have, whatever they have left, and it's telling them to attack the IDF on site. And it's going to take probably at least a year to clear out the rest of the remnants of Hamas from the Gaza Strip. And even after that, they're going to keep trying to build back. It's like a cancer that keeps trying to come back. And Gaza is going to have to receive chemotherapy for decades. And I'm not saying that because, I'm speculating. All we need to do is look at Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, after 2002, when the IDF finally made the decision to go after the suicide bombers and their senders and their labs in Jenin and Ramallah and Nablus. Here we are, more than 20 years later, 3 years later almost, and the IDF is operating in the West Bank every single night. So I don't understand what end of conflict people are talking about. I don't think it's realistic. I think that there's a way to manage the conflict. There's a way to look at the different stages. But from my understanding, the IDF is going to be operational in the Gaza Strip for decades going forward. And it has to be. That's one of the key lessons of October 7th. It's going to keep up the raids. I don't know if it's going to be every few weeks, every few days. I don't know, exactly what it will look like. I don't see the IDF leaving Netzarim corridor. I don't see the IDF leaving Philadelphia corridor. So I don't know. I don't know why this has become a catchphrase in Israel. It somewhat alarms me that I hear people in this country talking about an end to the conflict because I don't understand what they're talking about. So that's something that I put on the table. And beyond that, I pretty much agree with most of your points. I did have Sinwar and what motivates him. Yeah, he probably is scared of a lot of Gazans. I'm sure that there's been some interesting polling where actually the Palestinians in the West Bank are actually more pro Hamas these days than the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. That doesn't mean that Hamas still doesn't have a very solid base of support in Gaza. It does, because the society has been brainwashed for jihadist ideology for decades. But I think a poll that came out in November that was published by I actually can't remember who published it, but the poll was saying that less than 50% of Gazans now think that October 7th was the right thing to do. And the numbers in the West Bank are way, way higher.
Yeah,
So,
by the way, that's not as remarkable as some people might think. There is a tendency for people away from the arena to be more strident in their
100%.
views than people who live with the day-to-day consequences and reality of an arena, whatever that arena might be.
Totally.
The Israel-Palestinian conflict, as many people call it, is one such arena that I've noted in my work and in my travels, throughout the English-speaking world. You will
Mhm.
very often find students who are sitting on a campus, in the middle of the United States of America, have a far more strident view about what needs to be done and how it needs to be done than the people who actually live with, whether it be Israelis who are serving in the military or whether it be Palestinian Arabs. It's quite commonplace, actually, that phenomenon. And so,
Right.
on to some degree, I would expect what you've just said to be the polling coming out of Judea and Samaria.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. But the bottom line is that we are going to be fighting Hamas in Gaza for decades, but they're not going to be an army. They're not going to have 24 battalions and 5 brigades that are capable of invading southern Israel and conducting mass murder. That's never happening again. And the way to ensure that that never happens again is to keep the IDF active in the Gaza Strip for as far as the future, into the visible future and beyond. There's no way around that. And so anybody who's fantasizing about an end to the conflict should really snap out of it, because they're propagating a fantasy that's just as dangerous as the fantasy that led us into this disaster in the first place.
But it continues to extract a heavy price. We've had 3 soldiers that have been announced as having been killed inside northern Gaza just today. The rockets, to some degree, have returned. I think that we're on the 8th or possibly 9th day of rockets being fired from the Gaza Strip toward Israel. Obviously, nothing like the intensity that preceded October the 7th, but it should not be a returning tendency. We should not have, again, I made mention of the drip drip of hostages coming home. We also should not have the drizzle of rockets being fired on Israel from the Gaza Strip, which is one of the things that I will be watching with the Trump administration once it's stood up in full. Will they start to apply real pressure, as I've mentioned in previous conversations, to the Egyptians to take serious measures against the Gazans' ability to receive training outside of the Gaza Strip, to return to the Gaza Strip, to manufacture inside the Gaza Strip, and so on and so forth? Time will tell. But you've spoken about the changing nature of the intensity of the fight inside Gaza, and you're right to highlight that. And that's actually an ongoing, gradual process, right? There are nowhere near the number of soldiers now as once there were inside the Gaza Strip. But one thing is very, very clear: an enormous burden has been placed on the backs of reservist soldiers, or miloimnikim, reservists who have been called to the front. Some of these guys have served for over a year since October the 7th. These are people with families very often. These are people with businesses. These are people with professions and with jobs and day-to-day civilian pursuits. And their lives have been utterly disrupted. And what should be apparent from that is that the army simply is not big enough. We do not have sufficient manpower to fight this long, drawn-out conflict that you have described. And this is an issue that's been in the headlines today. And I want to give the folks just some idea
Mhm.
about what's taking place with regard to the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community. and the IDF's declaration, repeated declaration, that it needs more soldiers. It views the Haredi community, which currently doesn't serve, generally doesn't serve. There are some exceptions, but it's few and far between. It views the Haredi community as the natural pool from which it can draw talented, capable soldiers. And the IDF has expressed that it is ready to receive right now a total of 4,800 soldiers from the Haredi community. So there are currently approximately 1,800 that draft already of their own volition. And so a further 3,000, the IDF says that it's ready to receive right now this year. And furthermore, from 2026, the IDF is saying that it will be able to draft all of the soldiers of age and stage into the Israel Defense Forces from the Haredi community. It will be set up and propped up to absorb them. And just so that people understand this, there's actually been a decline in the number of Haredim who have joined the IDF. In 2015, according to data that was released, 3,022 men from the Haredi community were drafted into military service or national service, Yaakov. In 2022, that number was 1,758. So there is quite a precipitous decline going on there. And it's interesting, this notion that they can be drafted into either military service or national service. So national service would be, for example, serving in the Israel Ambulance Service, or caring for Holocaust survivors, or working in a hospital within Israel.
Or
It can be any
police.
number of things. And I think most Israelis would probably rest at that. I think most Israelis want to see the enfranchisement of the Haredi community within the effort for national security and national service. Although I think that number is probably reduced, the number of Israelis who would rest at them being enfranchised into national service rather than military service. That moment probably passed on October 7th. And if it didn't pass then, it passed as a result of the aftermath of that massacre. But something needs to be done about this issue. And I quite frankly think that there is far too much deference shown to what I view to be a completely illegitimate position, namely that uniquely the ultra-Orthodox community en masse need not serve in the military and need not serve by way of national service. I find it completely unacceptable, utterly absurd. It flies in the face, by the way, of Jewish history and the tendency of the Jewish people. A lot of people think that the Jewish people are not innately and never were innately a fighting people until the reestablishment of the states of Israel took place. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And I'm not referring
just ask the Romans.
Exactly right, and I'm not referring to the members of the Haredi community who are luminaries and exceptional scholars and needed for their Talmudic prowess and expertise. That's a completely different category, and Israel makes all due efforts for anyone who's of exceptional ability to be able to pursue those abilities uninterrupted. But for the preponderance of the Haredi community, surely now the number is up. Surely now the jig is up. Surely now it's time for them to be drafted into the Israel Defense Forces.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I actually happen to be an optimist about this, because my sense, and I have nothing to back this up. It's just a
Those are the
gut
best
feeling.
kinds of opinion, Yaakov. Those are the best opinions, the ones that
Yeah,
are baseless. Carry on.
totally baseless. It's just a gut feeling, but it's not devoid of logic. It's just devoid of any data points. Okay, here's my gut. Israeli society, as you've just said, is not going to tolerate this larger section of society shirking its basic responsibility to put its children on the front lines, just like the rest of society does. And because that tolerance is gone, whatever, future political arrangements
By the
will
way, let me just get into that, because before October the 7th,
yeah,
I think the main challenge that mainstream Israel wanted to see answered and responded to was, how do we enfranchise the Haredi community? And
right.
that didn't mean necessarily and exclusively that they had to be drafted into the Israel Defense Forces, but I do think it meant they had to be drafted into national service, as I said, or military service. And I want to know from you directly, do you think that I'm correct that that attitude was the dominant attitude among Israelis prior to October 7th? And do you think that I'm correct when I say that I think that that changed on October the 7th, and perhaps people would be much more strident in Israel about the idea that the Haredi community needs to be enfranchised, but by way of the military draft, as opposed to national service, the like of which I described just a few moments ago?
I agree. I think that that's correct. I think that's accurate. And, people are just outraged. They're outraged by the idea that they have to stay up at night wondering, when they're going to get their call from their husbands or their brothers or their sons or their fathers, and others, members of society don't face that risk to their very lives and don't pay the price for our existence here. So, that it's a very, very charged and contentious issue, and it's one of the deepest internal wounds I think that we have here, because when the ultra-Orthodox parties turn around and say, "Look, we're praying for you," that not only creates real negative attitudes towards them, but even in some cases towards the concept of prayer, which, by the way, is tragic because it's being
Yaakov, you
put.
must lean slightly back. I'm just going
Ah,
to alert you again. You're doing it again, Yaakov. You're putting yourself in a position where your face begins just below your nose on screen. So you're going to have to remedy
I
that.
appreciate the alert. So I
Thank
should
you.
have an AI system that alerts me to this.
Okay.
So, this is a real deep wound within society, because it actually puts, the concept that they are there praying and studying religious texts, and that is what's going to defend us against our enemies, is something that causes massive outrage to the point where it harms the status of Judaism in the state of Israel. And I think that that's tragic on many levels,
Just
especially.
develop that point. That's a very interesting point. You think it's not just causing a societal rend. You think it's actually damaging the status of Judaism in Israel.
Yes, amongst the liberal secular camp, because they say, "Oh, this
You
is,
think it's breeding contempt.
it's breeding contempt." Now, the antithesis to that is the national religious camp, right? Which,
Right.
which should be enough to tell, the secular Israelis, look, there are many ways to, do Judaism. Look at the national religious camp, serving, working. They're in the elite units and the commanders, and they're paying a terrible price, just like all of us. There's no distinguishment here, except that we know that Israeli society is divided into these camps, and people are even though it's terrible, they are counting. They're counting which camp, which tribe in Israel is losing how many of its sons and daughters in this war. That count is underway, whether people want to admit it or not. I think it's terrible that it's happening, but it is happening. So the
But
national.
Yaakov, just to add a layer of complexity to that, for people who are familiar with it, I've always felt that the standard for Zionist Judaism is best represented by what's called the Hesder movement, right? The
Mhm.
Hesder movement, or what you're referring to, right? The Datilumi, the religious Zionists who spend 2 years, I believe it is, or a year and a half, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a significant amount of time in the yeshivot, in Talmudic college, learning. And then they go and they serve in the Israel Defense Forces, I believe, for another 18 months. Many of them sign on more time. Many of them volunteer to become commanders and officers. And then at the end of their military service, they go back to the yeshivot and they learn there for 18 months. And most importantly, after that time has concluded, they are fully enfranchised within Israeli society. They go out and they get jobs and they have careers and they run for political office and they build startups and they farm the land and they sit in the offices and they become the lawyers, the doctors, the nurses, you name
Right.
it. So complete, total enfranchisement. In fact, adding to the number of years that they give to the country because they're so dedicated to studying Torah that they do the year and a half, then the year and a half in the military that I spoke about, and then another year and a half, which is longer than the 3 year draft that most people who are not of that strain undergo when they're in the Israel Defense Forces. So these folks would be beyond reproach. But there's a problem with what you're saying because you described them as the antithesis. I think what might be, if I may, a better description for them would be the antidote to this malady of people looking around and becoming turned off to Judaism as a result of what the Haredim are doing. The Dati Leumi, the religious Zionists, were that antidote, but there's a problem. And the problem is, Yaakov, that I don't believe that enough Israelis are able to distinguish, just on face value, by way of a cursory view, between the Dati Leumi mainstream who are in the Hesder Yeshivot and in the military, and the Itamar Ben-Gvirs and people such as him. And I think that actually what Itamar Ben-Gvir has done is that he's almost hijacked the knitted kippah, the kippah sruga, and when the average Israeli now sees the knitted kippah, I don't think that they're always, many are, but not always able to discern the distinction between an Itamar Ben-Gvir versus the mass Dati Leumi religious Zionist movement. And that's complicated the effectiveness and the potency of that antidote. Do you disagree?
No, I totally agree with that. I think that's a very sharp observation. When I say antithesis, what I mean is as a model of fusing, Jewish belief and a life that's defined by Judaism and military service, right? They have cracked it, in my view, and they are the proof that this is possible. And I totally agree with you that secular Israelis have a hard time distinguishing between a politician like Ben-Gvir and hundreds of thousands of national religious Israeli Jews. And this all goes back to very, very deep wounds that we have in society. But the reason that I'm optimistic is because I think that there are many ultra-Orthodox youths who are thinking about things differently. They are not adopting, in my belief, let's call it the reclusiveness or the fear that they're going to lose their way in the army. I think many of them are curious about what life in the army would be like and their ability to be soldiers. Many of them do not want to spend their entire lives in yeshivot. And I think that once the trickle turns into a flood, and I believe that's what's going to happen, then these so I call them the ghetto walls. Ironically, in the state of Israel, we still have people who are trying to build ghetto walls around communities because they fear that they're going to, lose their way and become influenced by non-religious thought and culture, every kind of fear you can imagine. That's why they're not serving, right? Let's make that clear to the viewers. The reason that they're not serving, the claim here by the rabbis, is that if they serve, they're going to lose their way, they're going to become secular, they're going to take off their kippot, and we're going to lose them. They're going to be indistinguishable from other secular Israelis. And as far as, the leaders of that community are concerned, that would be a disaster. So they say, you cannot assure us that that will not happen, and therefore we don't serve. That's their main claim. And again, the answer is the national religious model, and the IDF, I know for a fact, is going to make every effort to make sure that this fear that they have will not come to fruition. We already have a successful model. It's called Netzach Yehuda. It's a battalion. And this is a unit that I once visited, and it's incredible. By decree, by commander's decree, this unit has got to pray 3 times a day. They have stringent kashrut laws. They're accompanied by rabbis. They're studying texts as they train, as they fight. And this is actually, the laws of the unit. They're not allowed not to pursue this kind of lifestyle. And so the idea that it's not possible to draft ultra-Orthodox is simply nonsense. I think the IDF is totally correct when it expresses its confidence that it can do this, it can safeguard their way of life, and it can take this forward. So I'm an optimist. I think things are about to change for the better, and not only for military service. I think we're going to see the rise of a new breed of Israeli ultra-Orthodox people. These are people who will remain religious, in my belief. They already exist, and there's a few of them, modern ultra-Orthodox. They will retain their religious belief, and they will retain their observance of Jewish law, of halakha. but they
And
will
by
be
the way,
integrated into modern life.
yeah, but just to speak out and develop some of those points that you raised. Firstly, I'm reminded of my conscripted service in the IDF. So I was drafted in 2005. I was born and raised very much in the Orthodox tradition. I drafted into the Israel Defense Forces very much in the Orthodox tradition, but I drafted into a brigade that was a melting pot of all strains and stripes of Israeli society, as is very, very typical. Now, each morning, every morning, 40 minutes throughout basic training was assigned to you as an Orthodox soldier to go to the Bet Knesset, to go to the synagogue that was on base. Every base has a synagogue, and to say your morning prayers. The problem that I had with that was that firstly, I can't remember a single time that I ever needed 40 minutes in order to say my daily prayers. So it was a bit of a luxurious amount of time. At best, I think I was a 15 minutes type of guy that would start at Psukei Zimra and finish with Aleinu, and then I was done. And that usually took me about 15 minutes to do. But beyond that, the catch was, Yaakov, that Orthodox soldiers would be sent to the synagogue while the rest of the soldiers would do, I don't know how you translate it, would be called Misdar Boker, morning inspection. They would prepare for
Yeah.
morning inspection
Yeah.
and stand in morning formation. And so while I was at the synagogue, or rather, I was expected to go to the synagogue for 40 minutes while the soldiers were washing out the bathrooms and sweeping the floors of the tents and making sure that all the beds were aligned and putting on their uniform and getting ready for morning inspection. I was deeply, deeply uneasy, very uneasy with that idea. I viewed it as a luxury that was granted to me, that was not granted to my fellow soldiers. And so I rebelled. I actually stopped going to the synagogue and said that it was more important for me to do the morning, get ready for morning inspection, and I would wrap my tefillin, put on my phylacteries, say the bracha, say the shema, and then remove them, and that would take a total of maybe 3-4 minutes. So it was a very rapid process. Now, my completely secular commander, who was a 19-year-old kid, was a wonderful commander, called me over and he said to me, I've noticed that you're not going to synagogue. Why not? Why not? Why are you standing here doing this when there's a very clear command that Orthodox soldiers are to go to the synagogue first thing in the
Uh-huh.
morning? And it's a daily repeated command. The commander looks at his watch and he says, Datiim, religious soldiers, you go to pray now, and everybody else get on with getting ready for morning inspection. And incidentally, I never, ever, ever received any backlash from any of my fellow soldiers. So my unease was entirely from internal considerations and an internal
Right. Interesting.
discomfort. But this commander said to me, why are you not going? So I explained it to him, and he said to me, listen, Benjamin, if we in the Israel Defense Forces cannot give you, a Jew from Britain, 40 minutes to say his morning prayers, to adhere to the traditions of our faith, you have to question what it is that we're all fighting for.
Wow.
Now that's a 19-year-old guy, not from an Orthodox background at all, in any way, shape, or form, saying to me that he is commanding me to adhere to the principles that are important to me, were important to me as an Orthodox Jew. Now, first of all, I tell you that story because I thought at the time, and now that I retell it, that it's a remarkable story, just in
Very
and of
much.
itself.
Yeah.
But it also has relevance to this conversation because there is a presumption by many that so many of the rules that the Haredim are seeking to see within military service don't already exist and will need to be stood up specially in order to accommodate them. That's not the case. The kitchens are kosher kitchens. The synagogue is there. The time to daven and to say prayers is there. The opportunity to adhere to the Shabbat, the Sabbath, is there. Observance of the Chagim, it's all there. Most of this already exists, incidentally, by law within the Israel Defense Forces and is overseen by the rabbinate of the Israel Defense Forces, which is almost ubiquitous on Israeli military bases. Incidentally, when I was serving inside Gaza just recently, I was living inside the Gaza Strip during the time of my service, and living there with us was a member of the Israeli rabbinate. He
Right.
was a member of the Israeli rabbinate. I benched lulav and shook the lulav on Sukkot, for example, during my service inside the Gaza Strip because the rabbinate had brought the lulav to the base. This was not a Haredi base. This was not a
Right.
religious base, but the facilitation of religious practice is is uppermost, and it is accommodated very, very effectively. One of the main distinctions, there are several, between what is and what the Haredim are seeking is segregation between men and women.
Yeah, I was about
And
to
and
say that. Yeah.
right, but that's an easy fix, Yaakov. That is a pretty easy fix. Incidentally, I can tell you that suddenly when I was in service, there was already, this is not going to satisfy what the Haredim want, and I understand that. It does not rise to what they need in order to serve, and I respect that. But there were very strict rules of
Hmm.
segregation, how to dress, how to walk, how to make one's way from the tent to the shower and back again, what clothes one had to wear when making that walk in
Hmm.
order to avoid any indecency around the female soldiers, any interaction between the female soldiers and the male soldiers in a compromising position. It was pretty strict, I have to tell
Right.
you. But because it was strict, though inadequate for the Haredi soldiers, would-be Haredi soldiers, I believe that it can get to that level pretty quickly and pretty effectively. So there are a lot of religious tenets that already exist there. I think that they can be punched up a notch in order to accommodate the needs of the Haredi community, but I think it needs to be done now. And I'll tell you where I would temper your optimism, Yaakov. You're right that the IDF will find itself able to accommodate this need. I agree with you. I agree with you, and I've just given a very long-winded explanation as to why, and I apologize for that.
No, yo,
But
that was very
Yaakov,
interesting, actually. Yeah.
I'm pleased that you enjoyed it, and I do think it's an incredible story just in and of itself. But
Hmm.
Yaakov, you have politics in this. We do not have separation of synagogue and state. We have Haredi
Yeah.
policymakers as part of the governing coalition who wield outsized influence on all things that take place. And this is one of their pet issues, one of the issues closest to their hearts. And I don't see the readiness of the IDF to accommodate the needs of the Haredi community being met by the approval of the Haredi policy makers. So that's where I would temper your optimism. Doesn't mean it can't be done, doesn't mean it won't be done, but there's going to be some opprobrium along the way, without doubt. And you could also see the best laid plans of the IDF scuppered by politicking inside the Knesset.
Without doubt, I agree. But what I think we will start to see, and what I hope we will start to see, is growing numbers of ultra-Orthodox youths doing this without waiting for approval for anybody.
That's
That's
my
what I,
hope as well. On
that's
that,
what
I
I'm
agree with
waiting.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I'm waiting for. And I think it will start to happen because first of all, they're not all cut out for this life of a yeshiva. They're not all great scholars. It doesn't make sense to assume that they are. And so they're going to look for something else. And when they see the army saying, come to us, we'll take care of your needs, and you will come out a soldier of the state of Israel. I think that will be a call that many of them will actually end up finding too tempting to resist. That's my hope, and I actually think that it will happen. And I think that things are happening. There when we talk about societies, there are currents that are hidden from view. But my guess is that the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel is far, far from being monolithic. I think there are many streams, under that black hat, and there are arguments going on behind closed doors, and sometimes not so much behind closed doors. And I think these so-called ghetto walls, which should never have been built in the first place in a Jewish state, we should never have ghetto walls in a Jewish state. I think that they're going to start cracking.
By the way, not that it's a direct parallel, but I'm just reflecting as you talk about people willfully making that walk to the draft office. I don't think my own personal story is dramatically dissimilar to what you're talking about with regard to the Haredim.
Hmm.
I grew up in Leeds, England,
Hmm.
and my pathway through life was largely broadly charted, well charted. It would be that I would go to university, which I did, and then after university, I would go and begin my professional life, probably in the area of law. I don't know, but it absolutely did not include this idea that I would deviate so much, so far from the path as to say, I know that I've got my contacts here in Britain. I know that I've got my family here in Britain. I know that I've got my professional opportunities here in Britain. I know that I have my social considerations here in Britain, but I'm off. I'm out of here. I'm going somewhere else because I think that it's going to give me a better life. And I
Mhm.
remember seeking the counsel of anyone and everyone whom I thought might have been a wise man when I would make the walk to and from the synagogue that I attended on a Shabbat morning, which incidentally, unbelievably, was a 40 minute walk. Can you believe that? Walking in the sleet and the rain of Britain
Wow.
on a Shabbat morning to morning services, absolutely immiserating. But I would pick the brains of people and I would say to them, I think I want to go and join the Israel Defense Forces. I think that there's a place for me over there that I don't find myself feeling over here. And each one would say, you mustn't, you shouldn't, it's not a good idea. They don't need you. They've got enough soldiers. The way that you contribute to the state of Israel, here comes the Haredi parallel. The way that you contribute to the state of Israel is you go and become a lawyer and you make a good living and you donate your money to the state of Israel, and that will be you safeguarding the state of Israel. And why were they saying that? Because that's exactly what they did,
Right.
right? Not to diminish their contributions to Israel, but for me personally, that was never going to be enough. And so you have the Haredim who are being told that their contribution to the state of Israel is to sit in the yeshivot and continue to learn. But there are
Right.
enough among them, and I think you are correct. I just don't know how open their path will be versus how interrupted
Hmm.
and trammeled their path will be societally. But there are enough among them who will say, I know all of that, I understand all that, but I'm off, I'm out of here, I'm going because I see a better life and a more comfortable place and space for me in the rigors of the military, and I see better opportunities beyond the military. So
Yep.
I agree with you. There's absolutely no chance that they're monolithic. The question will be with what freedom can they walk that walk to the draft office? And time will tell. It also
Yep.
behooves us to acknowledge those Haredim who did actually go to the draft office on October the 7th and said, we have to be part of this, we have to serve. It's time for us to step up.
100%. I agree with all of that. And I agree, time will tell. It's an incredible situation because only in a Jewish state could this kind of argument between sects of society even arise. And the fact that this whole thing began with an arrangement between David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, and something like 400 or 500 members of the ultra-Orthodox community, and they were given this sort of exemption. The fact that it rolled into the scope that it is today is frankly unbelievable. And it's really just shows how, things that look temporary can end up lasting for decades. So, this goes back straight all the way back to 48. The precedent was David Ben-Gurion gives this exemption, wants the political support, from these political forces. As you say, there's no separation here between synagogue and state. And well, we're going to have to work through it. My hope is that whatever happens, we will be free of hate and we will be free of incitement. And also, my hope is that Judaism, the status of Judaism, what I was saying earlier, is not harmed because this is a tradition that belongs to all of us. And it would be a huge mistake to, throw out the baby with the bathwater, as they say, and to take a negative or a cynical view on thousands of years of tradition and text that belong to all Jews, and to allow this kind of thing to spoil that relationship. So,
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think that that has happened to a certain degree, and it makes me very sad and also a little bit annoyed when I see that kind of reaction among secular people to Judaism. I think it's a big mistake to have that reaction. And yeah, that's how I see things.
Well, two more topics and then maybe a question at the end. The first topic that I want to talk about is what's going on in Judea and Samaria, because we saw a pretty horrific terror attack that took place earlier in the week. It was an awful, awful event, and what we see there, in my view, is that the Palestinian Authority is simply not able to curb the activities of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, nor are they able to curb the activities of Hamas in Judea and Samaria. A lot of people don't realize just how present Hamas is inside Judea and Samaria. Were there to be elections held inside that area, Hamas would win a thumping victory there. And it makes me think that anybody who suggests that inside the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian Authority, which has proven itself so completely inept in Judea and Samaria, is the force to take over administration of the Strip. Anybody who's of that opinion seems to be, in my opinion, on the wrong side of a lobotomy. I cannot understand why anybody thinks that they are able to do that. What do you say about this continued talk that comes from various political arenas, various political spheres within Israel, that is oftentimes spoken about in the news stations, in the media, this idea that we all know what needs to happen inside the Gaza Strip. Palestinian Authority needs to be brought in. They need to be given the reins to the Gaza Strip. And they all say that with an incredible degree of certainty that completely ignores the failure of the Palestinian Authority, where they are currently tasked with governing, namely in Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, it's a very bizarre form of determinism, which I've also encountered and have challenged when I hear it. Let's say it in a simple way. What's Jenin, Jenin camp, not even the whole of Jenin, Jenin camp. What's that compared to Gaza? The PA cannot take control of Jenin camp where there are maybe a few hundred terrorists that are challenging their rule. And so if they can't do that, why would anybody on earth think that the Palestinian Authority can deal with a place like the Gaza Strip? It makes no sense whatsoever. I think, another thing to point out is that the Palestinian Authority had Gaza in its hands, and it was able to rule it for approximately 2 years. I don't think even that long, maybe a year and a half, before Hamas easily overthrew them, literally threw them off the roof, stormed their positions, killed them in a violent coup, which, by the way, Fatah has never forgiven them for. That's a blood feud that goes on behind the scenes that they don't like to talk about in front of the world, but is very much in place. And so the idea, again, that the PA, Fatah can rule Gaza is just nonsense. And, there's a certain degree of ignorance here as well, because the PA and its source of power is in places like Ramallah and Judea and Samaria. The Gazans don't. I haven't seen the Gazans asking for them to even come. Where are the Gazans saying, "PA, come and rule us"? They're not there. And the Palestinians who live under PA rule hate the PA. They think it's corrupt. They think, and it is.
It is.
And from an Israeli perspective, the PA, is really just enjoying both worlds. It's literally enjoying IDF protection. Without the IDF, there would be no PA, not in Ramallah and not anywhere else in Judea and Samaria, while it's using international forums to attack us. So it's enjoying the best of both worlds. And it's a very, very unsuccessful, and this is putting it kindly, entity which has shown no interest in properly cleaning up its act in Judea and Samaria. And so the idea that it can have any meaningful rule in Gaza is ridiculous. But what I could see, in the future, is some sort of a Gazan autonomy, and this is very far in the future, that is made up of Gazans. And these would have to be Gazans who have relinquished, the ideology of jihad, that are willing to live next to Israel as neighbors. I don't know how many of these Gazans exist today, but I believe that they exist. I just don't know how many there are and what percentage of the population. It's impossible to know. I don't even think that they're the majority today, Benjamin, but even if they're a minority, I want to reach out to them, and I want to find out who they are. And one day perhaps they can have that kind of autonomy made up of people like that, rational people. Names like Muhammad Dakhlan have been thrown about, who was a fairly pragmatic, a guy, local Gazan who was thrown out of the PA by Mahmoud Abbas for political reasons that we won't get into now. But I'm certainly interested in finding out who in Gaza and outside of Gaza could live next to us as neighbors who are not seeking our destruction. It's something that I think we should pursue, but never gamble any of our security on as a concept. Never gamble on it.
So here we have a fundamental disagreement. I'm not interested in, even in the distant future, living side by side with the Gazans. I don't believe that there is a sufficient number among the Gazan people, and certainly sufficient power among that number in order to bring about the coexistence that you've described and that you aspire for. Granted, you made it very, very clear that this is an idea that is the preserve of the distant future. I think that that future doesn't exist. And I think that one of the lessons that we learned, I actually believe that you've learned this as well, and that you're of this view. So maybe you want to express that, or if you disagree, you can do, is that quite simply the populations from which these enemies and these terrorists emerge cannot live right on our borders. They cannot be allowed to live on our borders. There has to be a separation from our borders. And that's why I'm a proponent of, at the very least, a buffer zone around the Gaza Strip, of moving the Gazans south. And of course, as you know, and as our listeners know, I believe that ultimately the immiseration of the Gazan people, which was brought upon them by themselves and by the people that they elected and by the ideology that begot the people who launched the massacre of October 7th, the remedy to their self-imposed misery, in my opinion, lies in the Sinai Peninsula, not in the Gaza Strip. So the Gazans can be, and they can exist, and they likely will exist, but anywhere that they establish themselves should be well away from Israel's borders. And I think that the fertile ground for them doing that is inside the Sinai Peninsula. And I'm actually hopeful that the Trump administration may start to discuss that prospect with greater vigor. But I know you don't believe in that idea, or you don't believe that that's likely to come about. But I think that that is more likely, unfortunately, Yaakov, than your notion of us existing side by side with the Gazans. I will not be convinced of that.
So I'm glad you're giving me the opportunity to clarify, because
Yeah.
as I've said, first of all, I don't think that the majority of Gazans are interested in living side by side with us today. I'm not talking about today. And also, I don't think that we should gamble any of our security on that. So what I mean by that is, if we identify Gazans who are prepared to live side by side with us, I think we should find out who they are and start working with them, because it's in our interest to do so. But I'm not gambling anything on that. What do I mean by gambling? Military activity should at no point in the visible or beyond future be frozen in the Gaza Strip. Whatever political reality we end up shaping or not shaping there, whatever autonomy ends up growing there or not growing there, that should have nothing to do with our military actions. That's the cutoff point that I'm making, right? There's no gambling. We must not gamble our security on that. But what I'm saying is that we should explore it. Without taking any security chances, we should explore it. And again, the worst model, that you could look at in terms of, let's say, living side by side is Judea and Samaria, right? There are 500,000 Israelis living right next to Palestinians. The thing that I'm looking at the whole time is capabilities. I'm interested in capabilities. I want to make sure that they cannot grow capabilities to murder us and to enact this ideology that's dedicated to conflict and to replacing us and banishing us from this land. If they don't have the capability to do that, then I think we have options to explore. If they do have the capabilities to do that, then we have a serious problem. We've gone back in time to October 6th.
The only problem with that, and then I'd like to move on to the next topic, is that this is what you're describing sounds to me like the formula that Israeli governments would put forward time after time when it comes to the notion of negotiating the dreaded, defunct, ridiculous, absurd two-state solution that everybody used to love. Still, far too many people attach themselves to the viability of. I've never supported that idea and never would support that idea, and have spoken against it frankly, anytime I've spoken on the subject, that formula being that the Palestinian Arabs should have all of the abilities to govern and none of the abilities to threaten us. It's not reality. There is an enormous spectrum of harm that they can do to us while not having the ability to overthrow us, to destroy us, to bring about the demise of the state of Israel and the people of Israel. And of course, we saw that on October the 7th. We saw just one example of the options that are somewhere there along that spectrum. So again, I've just had it with the idea. It's only my view, Yaakov. You
Yeah.
do not
I
have
just
to agree
don't, but
with
there's
me.
nothing I said that even comes close to a state. In fact, it's the exact opposite. A state
Not
doesn't
not a
have some,
state. I'm not talking about a state. I'm talking about
right,
the formula, this
right.
idea that they can have. Forget the idea of a state. Just
Yeah.
let's zone in on the idea that they should have none of the ability, no ability to harm us. Listen, the only way that you prevent them from having the ability to harm us is to keep them away from the border. You have to keep them physically away from the border. And if it's not the only way, it is an absolutely foundational method of reducing their ability to harm us. They need to be kept away from the border and, quite frankly, kept away from our people. And that is not compatible with the notion of coexistence, in my view.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, they can harm us even when they're not close to the borders. They can develop missiles.
Sure.
Uh,
So at the very least, keep them away from the border. At the very least, keep them away from the border.
yeah, look, they're not going back to the border because I mean there's at least a kilometer wide buffer zone. But I think in this day and age, as long as they're in Gaza, they can harm us. And you know, I'm looking at
And
weapons. I'm looking at
yeah,
weapons. My
yeah.
goal is for
Hence my
them.
call for them to go to the to be rehoused in the Sinai Peninsula.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons, and it's of course not a perfect resolution to the challenge. But I believe that the greater the distance that can be placed between the Gazan people and the terror leadership that they have an uncanny ability to support, the better. The better for Israel, the better for the Israeli people, the better for the safety of our soldiers, the better for the safety of our society. And I think that the resolution therefore lies in the Sinai Peninsula. And just to add one extra layer to that, I think that having seen the distraction in Gaza, which I've spoken about several times since I concluded my service there recently, that level of distraction has me absolutely convinced. By the way, as I always say, as extensive as the distraction is, it is equally justifiable and understandable and appropriate and necessary.
Well,
But the
yeah.
extent of that distraction leads me to believe that it is far more sensible to try and give the Palestinian Arabs, for those who want to do that, a new home inside the Sinai Peninsula, which is largely barren, than it is to clear the massive, massive distraction and start a building project anew inside Gaza. It just doesn't make any sense. That doesn't mean that it won't happen. The world often has a habit of often doing that which does not make sense. But I think Israel must work very, very hard to keep these people off our borders. And you're right. You're absolutely right, Yaakov. And it's exhausting to some degree. And it's also invigorating in another sense to think that we have endless challenges that are not bound by geographical proximity. But I think that the geographical distance that one can draw between the Gazans and Israelis is the more that you can bring about, the more blessed it is. And I'm firmly of that opinion. And that brings us actually to the last topic, if I may,
Mhm.
which really turns on this very issue, namely the state of the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. Now, we have spoken extensively about whether we should have gone for Hezbollah at the beginning, should not have done. We all know what the outcome of that is now. We know about the IDF's great achievements inside southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. We know about the pages. We know about the destruction of the command and control infrastructure of Hezbollah. We know about the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah. Our listeners know about that. But all of that was accompanied by the idea that the IDF required a buffer zone in southern Lebanon up to the Litani River, and the Hezbollah could not come closer than the Litani River. And the war was fought ultimately against Hezbollah, and the IDF, when it agreed to the terms of the ceasefire, did not stipulate that a buffer zone was a requirement, could not get that over the line, that demand. Hence, there is no buffer zone. The IDF is staying in southern Lebanon for a
Right.
total of 60 days after the fight. That's coming to a close in the coming days. And Uri Gordon, who is the commander of the Northern Command, the head of the Northern Command, Major General Uri Gordon, he
Mhm.
has said that the IDF does not intend to withdraw at the end of that 60-day period because, unsurprisingly, as I said at the time, the Lebanese Armed Forces, or LAF, as they're appropriately reduced down to as an acronym, is not capable of any enforcement of anything whatsoever that is part of the ceasefire deal. And so, in view of that fact, the IDF must remain. But, as I've
Mhm.
said, were the IDF to withdraw, absent a buffer zone, the Lebanese would return to their homes right on our border in northern Israel. And you move the Lebanese back to our border, Yaakov, you will be moving, not you, but if we allow the Lebanese to return right to our border, we will be allowing Hezbollah to return right to our border.
Yeah, first of all, that's true, especially if we're talking about the Shiite villagers who were basically, the roots of Hezbollah. So there's no question about that. Look, here's the way I see it. There are only two models for southern Lebanon. Either the IDF is going to end up staying there, which I think is right now looking unlikely. I agree that it's far from clear that they're going to leave after 60 days because of all the things that you've already said, so I won't even bother repeating them. We couldn't talk about why the Lebanese Armed Forces is having the trouble that it's having enforcing it, but I'll save that for a little later. So it's either going to stay there and reenact a version of the security zone, and we've been there, right? We've been there in the 80s and the 90s. The Israeli Defense Forces controlled southern Lebanon for almost two full decades, and we all know what that reality means, or they're going to pull back. But when they pull back, what's at least clear to me is that southern Lebanon will become another area A of Judea and Samaria. And what that means is that when intelligence comes in, that Hezbollah, and of course it will rebuild, of course it's going to try, instead of waiting for a monster to appear, they're going to move right in. And it could be from the air, it could be from the ground, move in at will, preserve operational freedom. By the way, this is happening right now. Hardly a day goes by without an Israeli Air Force strike on Hezbollah squad moving rockets, on Hezbollah moving to an area where it's not allowed to. Israel is already enforcing its very basic security interests during the 60-day period. And Hezbollah is very angry about this because this is a change. It's not used to this. What's Hezbollah used to? It's used to the kind of quote unquote ceasefire where it can just roll back in, crawl back to the Israeli border, start rebuilding its terrorist and military infrastructure. That's what they thought that they could do this time, and they're discovering that that's not the case. Something has changed fundamentally. So that's the good side of this equation. Now, I believe that what's important at the end of the day is the result. The result is that Hezbollah must never again exist as a terrorist army on our border. There's no doubt about that. How that's to be achieved, that's open for discussion. Is it going to be through the raids model, going in and out? Is it going to be through the reestablishment of a security zone? I'm agnostic right now. I'm not sure which way it's going to go, but I'm looking at the results. The capabilities must not be rebuilt. That's the only thing that matters. And however which way, this is also true for the ceasefire, by the way. The ceasefire is just a means to an end. Sorry, it's late here in Israel. It's not some sort of sacred concept. And this is what you're hearing from the Israeli defense establishment and the Israeli government. If the ceasefire has to be thrown to the side in order to preserve our gains in southern Lebanon, it's going to be thrown to the side. It's not a holy goal in any way. So I think that that's the most important thing. We preserve those gains. Hezbollah doesn't move back in. The Iranians don't move back in. And let's not forget that Syria, which was the main bridge, the conduit for all of these weapons from Iran, Now that bridge has collapsed. So sure, the Iranians are going to look for new ways. They could send flights and they could send ships to Lebanon directly. This is not over by a long shot, but right now we're entering this situation from a position of strength, and we're now in the position of having to preserve what we've achieved, and it's an incredible achievement. I'll say one more thing, Benjamin, about this. One last thing. The thing that disturbs me the most about this whole story of the northern phase of this war is how close we came to accepting a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, which would have kept the northern threat in place. It didn't happen. It didn't
You're
happen.
absolutely right. And by the way, I remember you speaking about this at the time.
Yeah, because last week the IDF put on an exhibition of a fraction of the arms that it seized from that first and second line of villages in southern Lebanon, and it's just it sends chills down your spine when you see thousands of anti-tank missiles, which somebody in the IDF correctly called anti-house missiles. That's what they would have been used for, and motorcycles, and just imagine October 7th times three in northern Israel. That's what they had planned for us. And so, the idea that we came so close to not dealing with this threat, and it's important, it has to be said that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in my view at least, made all the right strategic decisions during this war, first prioritizing the Gaza Strip, then insisting that there will be no ceasefire before that monstrous threat is removed. And we didn't know the full scope of that threat until our soldiers moved into southern Lebanon. That's when the full scope of that threat became apparent, despite all of the incredible intelligence that we did have on Hezbollah. And so, it's just vital that we never go back in time, and that these gains are preserved. And however which way that's done, the most important thing is that it does happen.
Yaakov, I said that I was going to ask a question. I'm actually going to save that for a different conversation. I want to
Okay.
thank you very much for being with me again today. I want to thank our listeners. If they haven't written a review of this podcast and subscribed to the show, I'd like them all to do so. Guys, please, if you're enjoying this content, write a review, share the podcast with your friends and your contacts, and definitely subscribe to it. It's our pleasure to bring you these conversations, and we appreciate you listening. And if you do those things, you can be assured that you won't miss any of our conversations. So thank you very much, Yaakov. I want to wish you all the very best for the rest of the week. Wish you a Shabbat Shalom, even though it's relatively early in the week. And of course, as ever, I pray for the safety of our soldiers, the return of our hostages, and for the wisdom of our leaders. And there is at the intersection of those three things, might be peace over Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin.